we'll start here at 1 o'clock. And it looks like everybody's connecting. Looks like we have a fast connection today, which is good. All right. Okay, so how we doing? Okay, so it looks like Facebook's up. Hi, everybody on Facebook. It's Monday. Hope you guys all had a great weekend. Let's see, what did we do this weekend? We worked. I worked. Lots and lots this weekend. Getting ready for oh gosh, see? I was going to say getting ready for metal immersion, but that's not really true, no, is it? Because metal immersion was last weekend, and this week it was, let's see, the inauguration. That was great. And then we did something on Friday. Oh, that's right. We did the boho ring on Friday, and did a little catch up yesterday on Zoom with some people on a project from last week. And here we are, starting a new week. Excited for that. What else was I working on this weekend? Oh, virtually ever crafting. Yes, applications were due about 9 days ago, so I've been working feverishly to get all the contracts out. So pretty excited. Contracts are officially out to all the instructors. All there is to do now is wait for them to sign those contracts before we post them on the website. If you have gone to the Virtually Ever Crafting website in the last 24 hours, you'll see that it has been taken down for maintenance because we're uploading all those classes now. So pretty excited. I've got about 15 classes up, and we're going through the proofing and editing process. Hopefully, fingers crossed, that we do it well this time. Not that it wasn't done well last time, but you know, there's always a mistake, and we're trying to do everything we can not to have a mistake. There's a lot of classes, so pretty excited because, so Virtually Ever Crafting, we have, I want to say like 6 or 7 new instructors, which woohoo, yay! And we even have a glass artist. So if you want to learn how to do glass bead making off a torch, we're gonna have a class on that, beginner class. Talked to her this morning, and she's putting together a beginner kit. So pretty excited. Do I want to do it? I'm afraid to go down that rabbit hole. We're busy, right? We're already busy doing everything that we're doing now, let alone add another thing to it. And what else is crazy? Jeff Hunter is definitely joining us for Virtually Ever Crafting. So that's pretty exciting. And I talked to him over the weekend, and I talked him into doing a short about how to choose your cabochons and what to look for in a quality cabochon. And I think that's going to be really cool. I should probably sit in on that one. Actually, I will be able to sit on that one because I'm not doing anything on Wednesday but one short. So I have time to sit in on a couple of classes. So yay. Okay, so are you ready, honey? So today is Monday, January 25th. This is week 45, and this is Q Talk Live. I'm simulcasting on Twitch. Hi, everybody on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, on 2 Facebook pages, my personal page, Q Farm Gray, and on Q Talk. So if you're out there, you can join my Q Talk page. That's where I load all the information for what's coming up. Some of you have already noticed that February projects are up, and you can register for them now. March is going to come right behind it. I know. How did we get into February? We haven't. We still have, actually we only have 6 days before February. Yikes. And then it's Valentine's Day and. But we are doing, we are moving forward, right? So today what we're doing is we're talking about gauges. What gauge, which gauge, when gauge, and how to approach that. The subject sort of came up last week when I had my friend Mary here, and she's like, you know, it'd be really cool if somebody would just explain to me what gauge to use when. And I went, oh, that's perfect. So that's how we got to here. And this is sort of the intermediary week. I know it's Monday, but we're not doing a project because we just finished up the hot and cold series, and next week we're going to start the Motley Metal series, which is enameling for 8 weeks at least. We'll probably end up at 12, but if you haven't gotten your Motley Metal kit yet, you still can. And it's all the metals and some of the little components that you'll need to do the enamel projects. It does not come with enamel, but you can get that on the urbanbeater.com website. So for today, there's no links to be posted except maybe a contribution link. If you find this or anything you've seen helpful, you can definitely contribute to keep this going. And let's jump in and start talking about gauges, okay? So a lot of people are really confused about gauges and how that works. Well, it should be confusing, and I always contend it's because a guy came up with it. What can I say? But what's confusing is how they came up with the number system, and it's hard to remember that the larger the number, the smaller the thinner it is, okay? And how I always like to explain it for people so that they can remember is that, yes, a guy created this, so it's going to be counterintuitive. But secondly, it's the number of revolutions around this arbitrary rod. Get it? So if it goes around a rod more times, of course, the wire is going to be thinner, okay, than if it goes around less times. That's basically how it works and how they came up with this number. We'll have to really go back to those founders to see who even thought of this. It's nuts, but we're going to go with it. However, something that you can do if you are confused is just take out a caliper, right? Take out your digital caliper and just measure it. And then you'll always know what you have. And there's always a chart out there. And by the way, I have these charts on my qfarmgray.com website of what the gauge conversions are, okay? So if you have a 10 gauge, then it's actually 0.1 of an inch or 2.59 millimeters, and your drill bit is going to be a 38, the number 38 drill bit. So that will help you. And you know, another thing too, there's this thing called Google. Anytime I don't know some of this, there's actually converters all over Google that you can just put it in there, convert, gauge to inches or whatever, and it will actually do it for you. So just remember that. I just love Google. I use it for a lot of conversion things. I do it for a lot of translation things too. So if I wanted to translate something that I saw, I use Google. So there it is. Now, a couple things that you'll see along the way is what's the difference between AWG, SWG, and BWG. These are all different systems of measurement. So AWG is the American wire gauge, SWG, also known as standard wire gauge, and BWG is the Birmingham wire gauge. Okay, so let's toss out BWG because it's gone out of favor. It's an old system. Let's not even talk about it. We're just going to put that to the side. So we'll go back to AWG, American, versus SWG, standard. So American's American, and the standard is actually what the Brits use. And depending on where you are, they'll use one of these two systems, okay? So if you had a 10 gauge in AWG, it is definitely different from a 10 gauge in SWG. Just remember that, okay? However, one thing that you can pretty much count on is that SWG is starting to lose favor. So predominantly, things that you are buying are in AWG unless it is designated. So, for me, I don't even think about it anymore. The only reason why I brought it up is because somebody reached out to me and asked if my book was written in AWG or SWG. And I was like, oh, gee, I never thought about it. And then I had to really think about it. I was like, okay, no, it's AWG for sure. And that's when I started learning that, oh, okay, you want to make these designations, and do you really need to? And after all, the book was not just written for Americans, right? Again, however, despite all that, mostly it's AWG, even internationally, okay? So keep track of that. Now, as far as how you look at gauges, okay, it is very dependent on the project that you are doing as to which gauge you want to use for which project. For me, because it is a very personal preference, I use the thickest gauge I can possibly use. And sometimes it has to do what I'm capable of bending or what is appropriate for the project. So that's how I choose the gauge. But there are some standards out there, and I'm going to discuss that today and share that with you. So if you want to take notes, I did not write any of this up. I don't know why, didn't think about it. But, stuff that you can take notes on. So go grab your notebook, go grab a pen, and you can take notes on this stuff because it is relevant, and they are standards that you can that you can count on. And most jewelers do use some these standards, okay? So let's talk first of all about bezels. All right, let's come in. So this is just a simple project that I have, okay? And it has a bezel and a back plate. Not great, but hey, and a back plate. So first of all, the back plate. The back plate can really be just about anything you want when you're making a project that looks like this, where there's no exposure of the back plate. And what do I mean by that? So if I was designing this, right, and I had a stone, and then I had this twisted thing, like I do here, but I'm going to change up my design, right? And instead of having the back plate be trimmed close to the stone, I'm going to make it into a design like so. Okay, and we'll put a tube in here because I like tubes. Okay, so if this is going to be your design, then this back plate now changes, okay? So when you are trimming this away, the standard is to use 24 gauge. That's standard. You can get away with 26 gauge. Why not? Because, honestly, I don't see why not. It'll save you a little bit of money over time depending on how much you do, because you don't need, everything else will make that back plate stable. Get it? I would not go any thinner than 26. I rarely go into a 28 gauge, and definitely never have I gone into a 30 gauge. I mean, for the first time in my life last weekend, I think I used 30 gauge wire, but that was very specific to a project that I didn't design. But if you're making a back plate where there is exposure like this, okay, where the back plate is fully out in the open, you need this to be no less than 26 gauge. And frankly, I find 24 gauge. I find this at 24 to be way too thin. So I would definitely, personally, would start at 20. Oh, I say personally, no. I would start at 22, but personally, I would go to 20. So for me, it's all about 20 gauge. Now, additionally, okay, you have to consider the weight of your final piece of jewelry. I love heavy jewelry. If you have met me in person and you have seen the jewelry that I wear, you'll see that all my pieces are a little bit more substantial and there's some weight to it. I mean, look at this ring. Look, this is like a really, really heavy ring. This is almost 16 gauge sheet metal. So you see, it's a not only a design preference, it's a personal preference. But on something like this, for me, preferably I would go 20 gauge, okay? And if I was feeling like really out there, I would go 18 gauge. So when you have exposure like this, no less than 22 would be preferred. 20 is great. 18 is even better. Okay, so that's what we would do with a back plate. Now, now regarding the bezel itself, okay, I was always taught on 26 gauge. 26 gauge bezel, what's nice about it, it's easy to move over and it's very pliable, it's very workable, but I use fine silver. Some of you like to use sterling silver, which is fine too. And I want you to think about this for a second. Sterling silver is a little bit harder than fine silver. And when you're trying to manipulate this and form it around a bezel, how much easier would that be if you went thinner, right? Some people do use 24 gauge bezel. I can tell you, I can hardly do it because unless it's a round round cabochon, or maybe even an oval cabochon. I really prefer that 26, okay? Additionally, at 26, if you didn't get your seam together perfectly and you're sitting here sanding, you're taking down a lot of metal. Imagine if you were using 28 gauge, how little metal you have to sand down. So you have a little bit more margin of error to work with when you're using 26 gauge for the bezel. Okay, the only time that I go into a 28 gauge bezel to make a bezel cup is when my stone size is less than 4 millimeters, and you're like, dear Lord, why would you ever make a 4 millimeter bezel instead of buying a bezel cup? Well, there are times when you don't have a bezel cup in stock, you have to make it. So that's why I would make it in 28, because I've tried it in 26 and it is just almost disastrous. It is so hard to do, okay? So you want to make sure that your bezel wire is somewhere between 26 and 28, typically 26 gauge for your bezel wire. Okay, so there's that. I do know some people use 30. Again, it's one of those things, I would never go to 30 because it's so easy to melt, of course, and there's very little room for error. But when you buy a pre-formed bezel cup, more than likely, it's somewhere between 28 and 30. But hey, it's pre-made, so I guess we don't have to worry about it so much, right? And it makes it really easy to bend over. However, what I have found in those pre-made bezel cups is when it's that thin, it has a lot of spring in it for some weird reason, and it doesn't like to move over the cabochon. Just a thought, right? Okay, so the next thing would be something like this. Okay, so this is a cuff. Now you can do this in, again, whatever you want. Some people would even use 24. Let me just say no, way too thin, because this piece is so structural, right? So this one is actually 18 gauge. It's really heavy. I like my jewelry to be nice and stable and heavy, and because I know that when somebody wears this, they're going to be flexing this off and on. And if you made a good piece of jewelry, this should last their lifetime. This shouldn't break. So if you go really thin, like a 24 gauge, it's going to break. However, 18, it's a little aggressive. By the way, this is a project coming up in February, and people were asking what gauge this was, and yeah, and I believe the response was, dear God, woman, why? Why? Because we like our jewelry, really nice and substantial. But you can definitely do this in 20. Again, personally, on something this big, this is 1.5 inches, okay? I would not go into something thinner than that. So for cuffs and things, I'm somewhere between an 18 and a 20. Of course, again, you can go heavier. I've seen it heavier. It's just harder to work with, right? So, that brings us to the question of how do you choose? Well, sometimes, aside from the design itself, sometimes you're going to have to choose based on your ability, okay? That does count. If you can't bend it, what's the point? If you can't bend a 16 gauge piece of metal, then the metal becomes worthless to you, regardless of annealing. Of course you want to anneal. Of course you have to anneal to get things to bend and mold and form easily. But if you can't do it because, I don't know, you don't have the hand strength, you have arthritic hands or arms or whatever, then it is not good for you. So you have to make that decision too. And as you work along and as you develop your skills, you'll start understanding and learning what you can bend physically are capable of bending and what you can't, okay? So in a cuff, I'm preferring 18 and 20 gauge. Now also understand though, because this is such a wide piece, I need to go heavier to create stability, okay? The smaller you go, the thinner you can go, because you don't need the stability in it becomes more rigid the smaller you go. So the bigger you go, the less rigid it becomes, and thus I prefer to go to a heavier gauge, okay? In here, this is a spinning ring, and again, my gauge here is 20 gauge. I will tell you, there are lots and lots of people out there making this with 24, okay? I'm really disagreeable with that because this is so wide that I want more stability in it. If the ring was really thin, like so this is, how big is this? I don't even know. Let's take a look. I think this is 3/4 of an inch, about 5/8, okay? If this was more of, say, 3/8 of an inch, you can definitely go thinner. But another thing that you need to think about when you're making something like this, because it's a ring, if it's really thin, it may start cutting into your finger. Something that people don't think about. So the heavier it is, the less likely it will cut into your finger. So here, I used to make spinning rings in classes. It didn't last very long. I used to make them with 18 gauge because, again, I love heavy jewelry. And what I discovered, back to discussion of being able to bend it, my students couldn't bend it. So that's why I went to the 20, okay? So that's, if you're making a ring shank, I would stick to about a 20. No less than 22 is preferable. And I know some of you know that if you wear the rings long enough over the years, it will wear down and it will create a weak spot. So this will give it less opportunity to create a weak spot. So there you go. That's what you're going to do there. And, I'm going to go back to the discussion of stability, right? So this project I made for Lapidary Journal a couple years ago. And it was a very simple, straightforward project. And but if you notice, there's single rings, right? If you were to do this any thinner than what I did, this is 16, it would bend. I mean, I'm using a lot of force here to bend this, and I can't bend it. So you have to, again, look at your design and see what it needs, okay? Because if it's going to bend, then the piece becomes a bit worthless, right? So here, this is 16 gauge, and we cut out the center, and it works just fine. I didn't have to solder or anything, okay? So that's what you get for going heavier. Now, had this been, let's say, appended back to something this size, right? It's really big. 16 gauge is great because it gives it all the stability it needs, but no one's going to do a pendant this big, just saying. And this, just remember, the bigger you go, the less rigid it is, and there's less stability, so you want to go heavier, okay? So the next thing you want to consider too, when you're thinking about how heavy you want to go, is what you're doing to the metal, okay? So here, this is an etched piece, just a sample I did somewhere along the line. And with etching, aside from the process, aside from the fact that the process is eating away the metal, you really don't want to do anything less than 24, because by the time you're done, you have 26 gauge. So again, I go a little bit heavier. I start at 22 so that I end up with 24. Okay, so you have to think about what the final outcome is going to be. Like if you're hammering it, are you thinning it out? Back to this one. I put a lot of texture in here, and I knew that this was going to thin out just a little bit. Now, if I hammered anymore, and you've seen hammered cuffs and things like that, you're stretching the metal, and you're thinning it out little by little, okay? So you got to think ahead. How hammered do I want this piece? If you want it really hammered, and you're using flat sheet metal, then you might want to start a little bit heavier, anneal, hammer, 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 until you finally get the look that you want. Okay, you don't want to start with thin and then all of a sudden be way too thin. Better to err on the side of more is better on that. Okay, so with the etching, that's the decision, is that how deep will you be etching? Okay, if you're etching, if you're going for a really heavy etch, you might want to increase that gauge to 20. If you're going for a light one, 22 is okay, and it'll get you to the 24. And also, you got to remember what you're going to use it for. So if you're etching and then you're going to make it into a cuff, you better start with that 18, because you'll end up with about 20. And again, depending on how heavy you want to etch it. Of course, this also plays into rolling. if you are rolling out your metal and creating textures, okay, that will absolutely thin out your metal. And here's a piece of advice for you. If you want to add, if you're using texture plates to add texture to your metal, what I always do is I always put a piece of copper and I test my copper before I roll out my silver. So I'll put a piece of copper in there and I'll start with whatever gauge I want. So we'll say 20 gauge and I'll put it in there and I'll roll it. And if my impression is not as heavy as I want it, I will roll a second piece and then take a measurement to see how thick it came out. Because maybe I can go a little thinner, or maybe I need to go thicker because I decided to roll it so hard. And by the way, speaking of rolling mills, Scott and Phyllis are going to be doing a rolling mill short for Virtually Ever Crafting. So I'm sure they will talk to you about some of that. So again, thinking of your process and thinking of the your outcome, right? What is going to end up with is how you're going to figure out what you want to start with. Is you want to make sure that you end up with 24 gauge, or you want to end up with 22 gauge and not 30 gauge because you rolled it, okay? Because you're stretching this stuff out. Another hint here, if you're rolling more than once, you need to anneal every 3 times that you're rolling, FYI, or you'll crack your metal. Okay, I'm sure Scott will talk about that. Anyway, okay, so that's your sheet metal, okay? Now, the next thing is, how do you know what gauge to buy when you're talking about a shaped piece of metal? This is where things sort of just fall apart, okay? So when you're buying wire and sheet, you're buying it by the gauge. But we're talking about round wire and this is square wire, okay? So you'll buy that by the gauge, and if you don't know the gauge, everybody who sells wire, if you just look at their chart, it'll tell you what the dimensions are. So this square wire is 12 gauge? No, 10 gauge. So it is, if you measure it, it becomes a 2.8-ish by 2.8 millimeter because it's square. If you're trying to figure out what the dimensions are. So where this falls apart is when you are buying rectangle wire like this, okay? And this one is rectangle wire too, okay? So when you're buying rectangle wire, heck, or even half round, so this is also March's project, but this is half round wire, okay? They will switch it out on you. They will no longer use the gauge system. What they're going to do is they're going to start talking about dimensions. So when you buy a ring shank in rectangle or half round wire, you're going to be looking at it by dimension. So this one is, let's see, 1.65 by, it says 8.12, but I know that this is, they're going to sell it to me as 8 millimeter, okay? So you'll buy it by dimension. So whatever it is, I'll bet you this one is this one. Yup, look at that. So whatever shank you're looking for, depending on how wide, so if you want this to be wider, you can actually buy rectangle wire that's wider than this, or you can buy it thinner. So like this one is like a 3 by 1.5. You can see that. And it comes in, a lot of these come in both copper, brass, and silver. It's just a matter of finding it. However, if you're buying rectangle wire and it doesn't have the width that you're looking for, you can just go ahead and buy sheet metal and cut it down, of course, right? It's just a heavier gauge sheet metal in the end. The difference here is the finishing. If you're buying sheet metal and they're cutting it, the edges are going to be really raw. Whereas when you buy rectangle wire, the edges are nice and finished. So another thing you want to keep in mind when you're buying rectangle wire or any kind of shape wire is the finishing. So sometimes they have a rounded edge. This one has a square edge, right? And this one has a rounded edge. By the way, if you have any questions, do just throw it out and Andy will relay your questions to me. Hopefully this is all making sense to you guys. Okay, so back to the edges. Okay, so depending on who you buy it from, they should be listing it, and they should show you the shape, like a drawing of the shape. Like for instance, let's see, I shall show you. Okay, so this rectangle wire, you'll see a diagram. They usually show you a diagram like that, so you know what you're buying. But this one has a rounded edge, and it will look something. My drawing isn't going to be great, but you see it has a rounded edge so that you know what you're buying, okay? So then with half round wire, this is also another sort of squirrely little thing, okay? Half round wire sometimes is purchased by gauge, and sometimes it's purchased by dimension. So there is a standard out there for half round wire, okay? So half round, what they're measuring for the gauge is this here, okay? So this width. So if you bought 16 gauge half round wire, this width would be the same as 16 gauge diameter, okay? However, if you get into, shall we say, different half round, like this one, okay, you can see it's sort of thinner on the curve. So this is called low dome, okay? So they have low dome and they have high dome, which means this is low dome and then they have high dome. So that's when they start selling it to you in dimension, okay? They'll tell you what the height and the width is, okay? And so if you don't have a caliper, then you need to get one, okay? Because it will save you a lot of grief in the end. Because if they tell you that this is, like this is 10 millimeter, then you can at least do this for yourself and draw it out, because you know it's really hard just to know what 10 is, right? So you can draw it out for yourself and see, so this is, and see how big it really is. I'm not doing a great job here, but you understand what I'm saying, right? So you can see how thick this really is by drawing it out for yourself instead of just guessing, going, I don't know what 10 millimeters is. I don't know what 1 millimeter is. So by getting yourself a digital caliper, you can definitely draw it out for yourself and know what you are buying, okay? So again, things get really squirrely when you go into the half round, okay? Also, there are, I don't know, quite a few mills in this country that produce metal, and all of them sort of have a slightly different draw plate. And so you really want to pay attention if you are buying half round from one vendor versus another. This could change as far as the dimension. And I know it's so weird. Okay, some of them will even call it like, oh, number 1 half round wire, number 2 half round wire. What the heck is that? And do I remember what that is? Heck no. So I always look at the dimensions and it will tell me. So if I actually do switch vendors, I have dimensions to go by to go, oh, no, I really need it like this. Okay. By the way, Andy also posted the if you don't have a digital caliper, he posted a link in the chat for you if you need a digital caliper. Trust me, digital calipers are great. Okay, so that's half round wire, okay? And then there's also triangle wire. OMG, did I just say triangle wire? I did. And I know I have a piece here. Hold on. I meant to pull it out before we started and totally got distracted. Here we go. Triangle wire, same stuff. I almost said the other word. Okay, so here we have triangle wire, and this one is number 4 triangle wire. OMG, seriously? So triangle wire is the same business as your half round wire. Is they'll all of a sudden talk about giving them number designations. Again, you want to look at that that chart and see exactly what the dimensions are. But I want to point out here that triangle wire can be shallow or really deep. So those dimensions count, okay? And again, I don't know how they got to the numbering system that they're using. I just know that they use it, and I find it very confusing. Back in the day, and I'm going to say, 12 years ago, when I started doing this, triangle wire for some reason was a little bit easier to find, and they were using the gauge system. Okay, so basically, again, oops, why am I drawing so small? I don't even know. Okay, so again, your triangle wire is the same here as with the round wire when they were using the gauge system. So if this was 16 gauge, it would be the same as a round in the same diameter. Okay, I can't seem to find triangle wire in gauges right now, so I don't even know. But if you come across that, don't be surprised. But you can still ask them for dimensions, and that will help you. Okay. So that's how you determine where you go with your triangle wire and whatnot. All right. So let's go back a little bit. I know I'm skipping around. I can't think today. It's Monday. How's it working out for you? I don't know. It's working out for me. Okay. Where I have my head in virtually ever crafting because I'm trying to get it up as fast as possible. Okay. But anyway, so what informs your decision to choose a gauge? As much as I talk about, stability and whatnot and your preference, actually, as much as I talk about your preference, it's about stability too. So this was a project last week that we did for metal immersion. I almost said virtually ever crafting. Wow. Okay, so these are discs. I chose to go with 24 gauge. Now, because I have a lot of stability in all this soldering in here, and this will not crush. However, if I didn't have all this stability in here and I was just doing this half round, I probably would have gone with 22 gauge, right? In fear that it will just crush if somebody was really hard on their jewelry. So you see how I'm making my choices as to what gauge I want to use. All right. So with rings, like here, this was made a long time ago. This is one of the first rings I made. And you can see I'm using 18 gauge. Okay. If I was to make this ring as a single ring, I would never use 18. It's too small. I would start at like maybe 14 or 12 gauge. And because this one is soldered back here, it creates a lot of stability, and it has all this stuff going on, like even in between it's soldered. And it's funny because I just noticed this isn't soldered together, but it would be nice if it was soldered together. But it creates a lot more stability, and I don't have to worry about it bending. Okay, so choose wisely with that. All right, so what else can I tell you? Come on, questions. Anybody got questions? Throw it out there. Sorry, Andy. Nothing, no questions. Okay, so either I'm doing a really good job at explaining all this, or you're just completely confused and stymied out there. But Andy says there's a question out there. So the question is, does any of this matter if you're using copper, fine silver, sterling silver, or argentium? Yes, because each one of these metals has its own hardness, okay? And, it matters, for me, it matters most when you're going thinner than when you're going thicker. Because, again, it gets more and more rigid as you get thicker, okay? So, for instance, here, back to this ring, okay? If I had done this in copper, no way, at 18 gauge, I really don't think this would be a great, a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Not productive, a very stable ring, because copper is so soft. So I would move this into a 16 gauge probably if I was to do this in copper. So fine silver, okay, so then you have sterling silver and fine silver. Remember, sterling silver is a little harder than copper, but fine silver is softer than sterling silver. Argentium, sorry, I have no experience with argentium to even answer that question regarding argentium. But so for me, I never ever use fine silver for things that are structural. Like, let's say I'm doing this in silver. I would never use fine silver. It's just too soft, right? So regardless of the gauge that we're talking about, I just wouldn't use it. Another thing too is I would never use fine silver to do, say, a prong setting because it's too soft. And that's why they prefer to use gold more than silver when you're talking about like setting diamonds, right? Because it's a bit harder. So yes, you need to consider how malleable your metal is when you're choosing. So if you're using something softer like copper, you do want to go a little bit heavier than if you're using sterling silver. Okay. Now for wire wrapping. Okay, so what's sort of funny is when I first started doing this, remember I was a beater and I was using mostly 24 gauge to do, the little tiny wire wraps like this. This one is actually 26 because it's so teeny weeny, but these little wire wraps, I was making earrings and things. So this one, and I would always use 24. And then every so often I would use 26 because, my beads were were so small. And it was really funny because this customer came in and she wanted 26 gauge and dead soft. I'm like, dear Lord, how much softer did you want this? What's interesting is I never really thought much of dead soft and half hard until I got really heavily into doing metalsmithing, okay? Because, you just need things to bend. And I have a certain attitude. You buy half hard, you can always anneal it, right? But so you got to look at your project and you got to think about how easy it is for you to manipulate. Now, last week, however, I did, I have it on my desk. I did this project with Sarah Thompson. And for the first time in my career, I used 28 gauge to do anything more than this little wire wrap, okay? And I came to realize that, dear Lord, you really need to go to that 28 or 30 gauge because it's so much more malleable, okay? If you go into your 26 and 24, you're going to suffer for it and your hands will absolutely suffer for it. It's not to say that it's not doable. Just remember, it just gets harder and harder to do. But when you're doing wire weaving, there's so much structure that you're creating that you don't have to worry so much about going into a heavier gauge. I mean, heck, Sarah was saying that she really loves to use 30. But if you think about it, this has 3 lines of weaving. See? 1, 2, 3, right? That 30 will be plenty stable and you don't have to worry about it. But let's just, for yucks and giggles, say you do this and you do 30 gauge. No way! Absolutely no way. It's not going to work. And by the way, you wouldn't see it anyway. So you got to think about it that way, okay? And so back to the wire wrapping, okay? For me, if I'm working with beads, it's about the hole size. The hole size will indicate which size wire I'm going to use. If I can't, and I try to use the heaviest wire that I can because I just feel like there's a little bit more stability stability with the wire, and because people are wearing this stuff and I want it to last, so by going heavier I have this theory that it will last longer, okay? So that's why I try to go a little bit heavier there. What was the other thing I was going to tell you? There was something else. Okay, so what other questions do you guys have? Anything out there? Okay, so Kathy out there says that argentium gets brittle with a lot of work and shouldn't be quenched. Yep, I learned that this past weekend working with Sarah. So when she's wire weaving, she's not using argentium to weave with. She's actually using fine silver because again, it's a lot more malleable, right? But I found that, well, I didn't have any fine silver in 28 gauge. So I actually did this with sterling silver, and for me it was just fine. And it was sort of fun because this was my first wire weaving experience, and Mary and I were just hanging out in the studio and sort of playing and practicing this weave. And I didn't have much, and I definitely didn't have much in copper. So I went ahead and pulled out my 24 gauge, and I did the modified sumac in 24 gauge. I annealed it and I was able to do it, but I will say it wasn't fun and it wasn't easy. And if it says anything, I believe Mary looked at it and said, "Good God," I believe, something like that. But so, you know, it made for a much more substantial. I didn't finish the piece. I actually ended up giving it to Mary, but to play with. But it made for a much more substantial piece, but it was a lot harder to work with. So there's your fine line. Back to that again, is what can you work with? What can your hands tolerate to what the piece is? And frankly, sometimes there are pieces that you can't do because your hands can't do it. I was talking to somebody else, like, yeah, you know what? I can't do that project because I just can't bend the metal. Okay. And no amount of annealing will change that for some people. So unless you can get it there to the point where you can manipulate it, there's no point, right? So just keep that in mind and don't beat yourself up over that. You know, I had one other piece here to show you to make a point. Okay. Don't judge me. Okay. This piece has been sitting in a drawer for basically since the first year I started doing metalwork. Yes, this is something I came up with the first year, and I never set the stone because I sort of hated it. Okay. But this is, what is this? 14 gauge? 14 gauge. Yeah. This is 14 gauge wire, right? And if you look at it in general, I would say that 14 gauge is not great for this. However, it did work out because I soldered on all these points, and you can see how rigid that is. You see, so you have to look at that design, and you have to see where you're soldering, where your solder joints are to create stability for your piece, right? And whether or not it will withstand whatever the function of that piece will be. Clearly this is a cuff and it needed to be stable. Well, not a great cuff. It needed to be stable enough to be put on and off. See, look, I broke the solder joint, but to go on and off. And, you know, because I needed this to bend a little bit to go on and off, I didn't go any heavier. And that's the question is, if you go heavier, would you be able to still squeeze your hand in there? I don't know. You know, so, oh, wow, this is a really horrible piece. That's all falling apart on me. It's a good thing it never became anything. So, you know, can I get this in here and mold it back down and still make it work, right? That's the question, right? So if it doesn't, then going heavier does not help you. And so there's the other, that's the other decision is if it doesn't work functionally, then there's no point in going heavier or going thinner. So that's how you find that little bit of room of how, or the what am I thinking? The parameters in which you're working in. Okay, so that's about it. That's all I can think of. What else can I tell you? I don't know. Okay, so we talked about bezels. We talked about back plates, right? And we talked about different metals, and we talked about gauge today as to what gauge you should use and how to figure out what a gauge is. Just remember there are charts out there so that you can look it up if you're wondering, especially when you're buying it, okay? And frankly, for me, you know, I've gotten past the point of a beginner. But as a beginner, it's really hard to figure out which way to go. So at some point, what I did was I started buying just a sample and that helped me. So I keep a little bit of everything here now for several reasons. Is one, it helps me figure out what gauge I really need, right? By having maybe a foot of all these different gauges. And two, it also helps me when I'm designing that I don't get caught in the lurch, right? So it's like I'm sitting here designing and, oh, crud, I don't have the right gauge. I'm going to have to wait another week before I get it in. And when we're sitting here and we're doing our design process, we're really I'm really fluid about what I'm doing, and I just want to get there and I want to try it and I want to test it to see if it works. I don't want to wait a week for it. And I'll show you this ring. Yes, this ring can be a weapon. This ring took me so long to make because I didn't have the right gauge of metal in stock. So what did I end up doing? Yup. I took sheets of metal and I soldered them together and I put them through the rolling mill so that I could get to this thickness. So after I made this ring, that was it. I was never going to have this problem again. So here you'll see, hold on. So you'll see that I have all different widths and thicknesses of rectangle wire, half round wire, and whatnot. And I don't just buy an inch of anything because it's never useful. I always buy 3 inches because it's enough to make a ring shank, and if I'm going to use it for a pendant or something else, it's definitely enough to get me to finish a project. Okay, so a question is, what's my favorite jump ring gauge? I like 19 gauge, and I know you guys are all have been complaining about me and my 19 gauge. What happened? I don't know what happened. But this happened a long time ago. This happened when I first started. So I discovered that 20 gauge was too thin and 18 gauge was a little too thick, but for a lot of the projects that I was making at the time, so I settled in a 19 gauge. So if you notice, when we were doing Minimal Metal, everything, and the book Minimal Metal, everything was 19 gauge wire or 19 gauge jump rings. Okay. However, if that's not agreeable to you personally, I don't go thinner than 19 gauge. I always go thicker. So all my jump rings are definitely 19 gauge or thicker. So the next one up is 18 gauge jump rings. So again, depending on the project, it's going to be 18. But I have something to share with you. And I see the question there about tubes. I'll be right back. I will address that, but I'm going to show you something. Hold on. Okay. Okay, hold on. I'm going to show you a little tricky here. We were talking about it, I don't know, I think it was Mary and I were talking about it over the weekend, right? And about those jump rings. Hold on. And just like check this out. Let me zoom out and I'll show you. Oops, zoom out. Okay, so just like the ring shanks and whatnot, I have a whole bunch of different sizes of jump rings, just in case I need it. So my jump rings start from 3 millimeters OD all the way up to 12 millimeters OD. And of course, the larger my jump ring, the heavier the gauge, because it's about that stability. So this one is actually 18 gauge, 6.5 millimeter OD, right? So there was this product out there, or still is, called, I know, I shouldn't do this, but I'm gonna do it, called Jumpies. Is that right? I want to say, or Snappies, right? So they had these jump rings, and their whole marketing was that if you twist these jump rings, then what's going to happen is it's going to snap, right? After a lot of research into this, I'm like, really? I bought some, but one would think that however they did it, one side would be convex and the other side would be concave. Well, when you order it in and you look at it, no, it's not. However, you can, the key to the jump ring is that it was a very heavy gauge jump ring. That's all. And I believe it was 18 gauge. But here, you guys won't, I don't think you'll be able to hear this, but if you have a jump ring and you work it just like this and you start pushing it towards each other, okay, as you're pushing it towards each other, you can make it snap. I actually just made it snap. I don't know if you heard that. Because the ends are rubbing up against each other. And that's how, that's all it is, right? It's a heavier gauge jump ring. So there you have it. Hopefully I answered your question on that. So the question about tubes, okay? What tubes do I like to use for my bales? Well, one thing is for sure is I like a heavy gauge tube if I'm using it for a bale, because anything that is structural, I want it to be heavier. And I have a couple tubes here I can show you. Okay. Hold on. So I always use a heavy gauge tube, and the size that I'm looking for is always how big is that hole and can I get my chain through it, right? So typically it is going to be, why do I have two sizes here? Hold on. Okay, so this is a 3 millimeter. I'll show you. It's definitely too small. So I'm definitely going to at least 4 millimeter. Oh, there we go. Okay, so you can see the difference. And this one, I think these two are the same. So hold on. Okay. So this is a 4.8. You could go a little bit smaller. I don't have one here. Or do I? Oh, I do. Who knew I had so much tube? There we go. Okay. You can see the different sizes that I have. And let me zoom in. There we go. Okay. So you see the different sizes that I have. So it depends on the project and how substantial I want it to look, because I want a balance in the piece. So here, you can see this piece. If I was to have put this 5 millimeter one, it looks a little odd. You see what I'm saying? I think the smaller one is definitely a little bit more appropriate. And so you got to look at that design and see what informs you. Whereas here, another thing too is, okay, albeit these two are very similar in diameters, this one is heavy and this one's thin. So that inside diameter counts, right? Because no way is a chain going to go through here, not the chain I'm thinking of anyway, but it's the end of the chain, unless you take the chain out and solder the catch after you install it, right? But for me, most of the time, people want to be able to take their chains in and out and exchange it with other things. So you want to make sure that your inside diameter is going to fit the chain, okay? So here, this one, I would say that this is my most commonly used size. And this is, oh, geez, you again. Okay, millimeters, there we go. So this is, so you can see 3.89. I bet you if I keep doing this, it's going to be closer to a 4. Okay, so it's a 3.9 is what that is on the outside. And again, when you're buying tubes, you got to be careful. They sell it thin-walled and thick-walled, and you can see that very, very quickly with the difference between these two. You see one's really heavy and one's really thin, albeit this one, if it's cleaned out a little bit, it'll thin out just a little bit. That's from sawing the thickness of that. So that is something to consider. Who makes 19 gauge? You can get it from, like, Blake Brothers is one, and was a question, who makes 19 gauge jump rings? I know Blake Brothers, and I'm trying to think, it's just like totally slipping past my head right now. I can't think of my vendor's name. Anyway, it's wait. Okay, so I'm sorry. talking a little bit about tubing size, stone diameter, for example. What size tubing to use for a 3 millimeter inside? Okay, so I will address that other tubing question in a second. Andy, you said something? Oh, okay. So back to the bezel real quick. There was a question, what's my favorite bezel gauge? I always use 26 across the board, 26. Unless, again, I'm making a 4 millimeter bezel, then I go to 28 gauge. So regarding tubing diameter for tube setting, that's a question. Okay, so if you're doing a 3 millimeter tube, you cannot buy a 3 millimeter ID being inside diameter tube, because then the stone would slip right through it, right? So here, let's see, we'll look at this one. What you need to know is the inside diameter of this tube. So this is considered 3, I'm looking at the label, it's a 3 millimeter tube, but the inside is, let's see if I can measure that well. The inside is 2 millimeters. Okay, so I would have gone with a thinner tube instead of this one, because it's a lot of material to cut. Okay, and actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to start over. This would never work for a 3 millimeter stone, because the outside is 3 millimeters, but you need the inside to be cut to a 3 millimeter so it fits, right? So you would have to go with a bigger tube to make that work, okay? Because I'll draw it for you. It's easier. It's easier. Okay. Yoips. So here, right? So if this is 3 millimeters to the outside, not the inside, but the outside, right? And your stone is 3 millimeters, where's it going to fit? It's not going to. So you need the outside to be bigger so that you can cut away on the inside for this to fit, right? So here, let's pull out this tube that I have. Hold on. Let me see. Dope. Okay, where is my caliper? So let's measure the inside of this and see where I end up with. See if I can give you a working example here. Okay, so here, this is not going to work either, right? Because the inside is actually too big already. If I was to put it's measuring at 3.15, which means a stone is going to slip right through. So you need to get a smaller tube, or you need a thicker wall. Get it? So the inside here, this inside part, will have to be smaller than 3 millimeters if your stone is 3 millimeters, so that you can cut. So this is the inside, so you can cut away from it. Get it? So it would probably be, the inside diameter would probably be somewhere about 2.75 is what I would head for, because that's what I'm cutting away. Okay, so hopefully that helps a little bit. That's a whole another long long explanation. I'm doing that really quickly here. Okay, so tubing. How do we get into tubing? I don't know how we got to tubing, but there we are. We're now into tubing. Okay, so what else can I tell you about gauges? So tubes are, of course, not going to be sold to you by gauges. It's going to be sold to you by size, by dimension. So inside diameter and outside diameter. If you need to figure out how much wall you have, you do the math. So meaning how thick this is. So if they give you the ID, you subtract it from the OD, and then you have the size, the thickness of your tube wall. Okay. So the last thing is, how do you figure out your drill bit to your wire gauge? Well, that's what a chart's for. Back to that chart that Andy posted. So if you look on there on your drill bit charts, right, you can just look at the gauges. If you have 18 gauge, you need a size 56 drill bit. Be very careful here too, because drill bits are the same thing. Drill bits there's different systems for drill bits, okay? And I didn't look that one up, I can't think of it. But bottom line is they will still give you the dimensions of the drill bit. Okay, they'll tell you what the thickness of that drill bit is, and or shall we say the diameter, because it's round. They'll tell you what it is, and you just do the backwards lookup to figure out if that works for your gauge wire. If you're trying to rivet something, this is really important. I look up the chart all the time. I don't have the stuff memorized, so I use the charts all the time to figure out what my drill bits are. And at this point, because I'm doing so much, I do keep drill bits that are 51 through 74. This is my range here, and it's every so often that you have to go outside of that, and then I'll just pick it up from there. But this is what I keep in stock because this is what I use most of the time. And you need to look at what you're using to figure out if you what you want to keep in stock. Of course, don't just arbitrarily buy this stuff. I mean, really, well, heck, you can. It makes better sales for us. But just saying, look at the gauge wires that you have before you buy your drill bits to figure out what is most practical for you. Okay, so that's me rambling on and on and on and on. And thanks for the great questions. Thanks for hanging out. I can't think of anything else that's going on except I'm, again, working on Virtually Ever Crafting. On Wednesday, we are going to do the next step-by-step surprise. It is step-by-step surprise twisted. If some of you guys got an arbitrary package of 2 1-inch silver discs, it goes with the step-by-step surprise twisted this week. And so I'm excited for that because I really love this design. And then on Friday, we are doing, what are we doing on Friday, honey? We're doing a project. Oh, Foursquare. That's right. We're doing the Foursquare project coming up on Friday. Remember, February projects are posted and available if you want to join us. Excited. I'm taking some departures from what my normal design is, as you can see, especially with this one. It's a complete departure from what I normally do. And so is the surprise project is a little bit different too for the step-by-step surprise radiant. Totally excited next week for the Valentino, step-by-step surprise Valentino. I'm sure you guys can guess what it is. You should be able to guess what it is. Hello? Okay, so Debbie's asking if we got the drill bit sampler back in. I think so. Did we get it back in, honey? Okay. I'm pretty sure we did. I will message you, Debbie, on that. I think it's in the box that we had come in over the weekend. All right. So on that note, great beginning of the week. Not a disastrous Monday. Yay! And I'm going to go to work. Everybody, have a great rest of the week. We'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks for hanging out, and thanks for your continued support. We'll see you then. Bye.